42 centuries of silence ended when the hydraulic seals on Vault Theta 9 hissed with the sound of a dying god's final breath. I stood among the secondary logistics crew, a mere data scribe tasked with recording the atmospheric pressure of a tomb that had been forgotten by everyone except the master of mankind himself. The air that rushed out tasted of ancient ozone and the metallic tang of dried copper, a scent that shouldn't exist in a vacuum-sealed stasis chamber. As the reinforced adamantium plates slid back, the vox casters throughout the sub-sector emitted a single, low-frequency hum that vibrated the very marrow in my bones. We were told this sector was a waste reclamation site, a lie maintained for millennia to hide the pulsating, rhythmic light emanating from the center of the dark hole. The experiment was never meant to be found. And as the primary containment field flickered, I realized the terror wasn't that it had failed, but that it was still trying to succeed. The descent into the lower reaches of the sanctum began not with a command, but with a collective, instinctive movement born of a terror so profound it mimicked religious devotion. My boots, reinforced with the standard steel toe caps of the logistics corps, clicked rhythmically against the cold floor of the bridge way, each step echoing through the silence of a tomb that had been sealed since the days when the stars themselves seemed to bleed. To understand the weight of what we found in Vault Theta 9, one must first understand the silence of the deep palace, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but a heavy, physical presence that sits upon the chest like a leaden shroud. It is a place where the air is recycled through filters that have not been scrubbed in 10 generations, carrying the faint, metallic tang of ancient lubricants and the dry, papery scent of decaying parchment. We were 40 levels below the last known inhabited floor, a region where the maps become speculative and the light strips flicker with a rhythmic, dying pulse that matches the heartbeat of a sleeping titan. The walls here are not merely stone or steel, they are thick with the accumulated grime of millennia, layered with the soot of trillions of prayers offered to an emperor who, in this dark depth, feels less like a savior and more like a jailer. The primary doors of the vault were not operated by standard pneumatic systems, but by a complex arrangement of counterweights and gravity, anchors that groaned with the protest of metal being forced to move after an eternity of stillness. As the gap widened, the smell hit us first, not the expected rot of a grave, but something far more unsettling, the scent of a sterile chemical laboratory mixed with the sharp, acidic bite of a lightning strike. It was a smell that spoke of high-tier bio-alchemy and the kind of physics that the Adeptus Mechanicus usually reserves for the destruction of worlds. I felt the fine hairs on my arms stand up as the localized reality within the chamber began to warp, the visual perspective stretching and twisting until the far wall seemed miles away, then suddenly inches from my face. My data slate, a ruggedized unit designed to survive the vacuum of space, began to emit a high-pitched whine, its screen flickering with jagged lines of static that looked like the jagged teeth of a predator. We were looking into a failure that was never meant to be recorded, a project so ambitious and so catastrophic that the very memory of it had been excised from the Imperial archives with a surgical precision that left only a scar of redacted text. The floor of the main chamber was paved with interlocking plates of obsidian glass, each one etched with script that moved when you weren't looking directly at it. As I stepped forward, my shadow was cast in 3 different directions by the fluctuating light of the containment field, a flickering amber orb that hovered in the center of the room like a captured sun. Within that light, suspended by chains of liquid mercury that defied the laws of fluid dynamics, was the subject. It did not look like a monster, at least not at first glance. It possessed the proportions of a man, though scaled to the size of a primarch. Its skin the color of burnished ivory and covered in a fine, silver mesh that seemed to be growing out of its pores. But where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface of translucent bone, beneath which something dark and many-limbed pulsated with a slow, agonizing rhythm. This was not a creation of the warp, nor was it a Xenos horror. It bore the unmistakable signature of the Emperor's own hand, the same divine geometry found in the gene, seed of the Astartes, but twisted into a shape that suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of the soul's capacity to inhabit flesh. I watched as the Magos, biologist leading our team, stepped toward the containment field, his mechanical dendrites twitching in a frantic dance of data collection. He did not speak, for his vocal cords had long ago been replaced by a vox grill that only emitted the binary cant of the machine, God. But the frantic clicking of his metal limbs betrayed a state of agitation that bordered on religious mania. He reached out a gloved hand toward the shifting amber light, and as he did, the subject within the chains began to change. The ivory skin rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond, and the dark mass beneath the bone mask surged forward, pressing against the translucent surface with enough force to cause a sickening, wet crack. It was then that I noticed the cables, thousands of them, thinner than human hair, trailing from the subject's spine and disappearing into the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. This room was not just a prison, it was a neural junction. The entire sub-sector was being fed by this thing, or perhaps this thing was feeding on the sub-sector. The energy readings on my slate spiked into the red, the numbers spinning so fast they became a blurred line of nonsense, and the taste of copper in my mouth turned to the taste of hot, iron blood. The history of the Great Crusade is a history of perfection, of the Emperor crafting the ultimate tools to reclaim the galaxy. But here in the dark, we were seeing the rough drafts of a creator who had experimented with things that should have remained in the void. There are whispers in the forbidden corners of the palace about the protocol of the unspoken, a series of trials where the Emperor sought to bridge the gap between the usical and the psychic without the use of the navigator gene or the dangerous shortcuts of the warp. Looking at the ivory, skinned figure, I realized I was looking at the physical manifestation of that bridge. It was a creature designed to be a living conduit for the light of the Astronomicon, a way to anchor the Emperor's will into the material realm with such permanence that the warp would become irrelevant. But the flesh is weak, and the soul is a flame that consumes its wick. The subject hadn't just failed to become a conduit, it had become a vacuum, a hollow point in reality that was perpetually trying to fill its emptiness with the world around it. I saw a servitor near the edge of the platform suddenly collapse, not because it was attacked, but because the very color was being drained from its form, its gray flesh turning to a translucent, gelatinous sludge as its molecular stability was unraveled by the mere proximity of the experiment. We stood there for what felt like hours, though the chronometer on my wrist insisted only minutes had passed, trapped in a stasis of our own making as we realized the magnitude of the heresy we were witnessing. To reveal this would be to invite the immediate and total erasure of our entire lineage by the Inquisition. Yet to remain silent was to allow a ticking bomb of ontological collapse to remain beneath the heart of the Imperium. The Magos turned to me, his glass, lensed eyes reflecting the dying amber light of the containment field, and for the first time in my life, I saw a machine man weep. A single drop of synthetic oil rolled down his metal cheek as he keyed a command into his wrist-mounted console, a command that I knew would not seal the vault, but would instead begin the process of waking the subject. He believed, in his mechanical madness, that the experiment could be completed, that the Emperor's unfinished work was a puzzle meant for us to solve. As the mercury chains began to vibrate, and the ivory skin of the subject split to reveal 1,000 weeping eyes of pure, cold light, I knew that we were not the heirs to a great secret, but the victims of a divine mistake that was about to reclaim its voice. The awakening of the subject did not occur with a sudden burst of violence, but with a slow, agonizing dissolution of the silence that had governed Vault Theta 9 for millennia, As the Magos, biologists bypassed the final tertiary inhibitors. The sound that filled the chamber was like the grinding of tectonic plates heard through a thick layer of stagnant water. It was a sound of immense, frustrated pressure finally finding a microscopic flaw in its vessel. I watched, my fingers locked in a white, knuckled grip around the hilt of my utility blade, as the liquid mercury chains began to boil. The droplets didn't fall. They drifted upward, defying the artificial gravity of the floor, plates, forming a swirling metallic halo around the ivory titan. The light in the room shifted from the warm, sickly amber of a dying hearth to a cold, piercing violet that seemed to strip the color from our very skin. My own hands, visible in the peripheral of my vision, appeared as monochrome statues of salt, the blood beneath the surface invisible under the oppressive radiation of the experiment's revival. It was as if the creature was reclaiming the light of the universe for itself, leaving only a gray, leaching void for the rest of us to breathe in. The Magos was chanting now, a low-volume stream of binary prayers that sounded like the rattling of dry beans in a tin can. His mechanical frame hummed with the effort of maintaining a data tether to the vault's ancient cogitators, which were screaming in a language of error, codes and overheating logic gates. To my left, a fellow scribe, a man named Kale whom I had shared nutrient, paced with only hours prior, let out a soft, wet sound. I turned to see him clutching his throat as his eyes began to weep not tears, but a thick, silvery fluid that mimicked the mercury chains. He wasn't screaming, he couldn't. His very biology was being rewritten by the proximity of the creature's unfolding soul map. The air in the vault had become a thick soup of ontological static, and every breath I drew felt like swallowing a handful of needles. The creature's ivory skin began to slough off in long, translucent strips, revealing a musculature made of tightly wound gold filaments and pulsing, bioluminescent nerves. It was a body designed for a god, but inhabited by something that had forgotten how to be alive. The experiment, which the redacted scrolls hinted was designated Project Pariah Engine, was the Emperor's attempt to create a living conduit that could manipulate the Imperium without the corrupting touch of the warp. It was meant to be the ultimate soldier, a being that could stand in the presence of a daemon and simply wish it out of existence by asserting the absolute primacy of the physical world. But as the chest of the Titan heaved with its first true breath in 40 centuries, the shockwave of its displacement sent us sprawling. The force wasn't kinetic, it was a wave of pure, unadulterated reality. The shadows in the corners of the room became so black they looked like holes cut into the fabric of the world, and the light became so sharp it cut the retinas. The subject raised its head, and the bone, mask that served as its face, shattered outward. There were no features beneath, only a swirling vortex of that same cold, violet light, shaped roughly into the suggestion of a screaming mouth and wide, staring eyes. It looked at us, and for a heartbeat, I felt the entirety of my life, my memories, my name, my devotion to the throne, flicker like a candle in a hurricane. To this being, we were not even dust. We were errors in the equation it was trying to solve. The Magos, biologist, moved closer, his dendrites extending to touch the creature's shivering, golden, thread muscles. He was weeping oil and binary, his systems failing under the sheer weight of the data he was trying to harvest. The great work, he hissed through his Vox grill, the sound distorted and breaking. The Emperor's lost song. We shall complete the melody. He was insane. The logic of the machine god had been eroded by the sight of a perfect, failed divinity. The creature reached out a hand, its fingers long and tapering into points of diamond, hard crystal. As it touched the Magos's brow, the tech priest didn't explode or burn. He simply ceased to be a solid object. His red robes, his bionic limbs, his remaining flesh, they all collapsed into a singular point of infinite density, a marble-sized sphere of compressed matter that fell to the obsidian floor with a heavy, final thud. The creature had not killed him. It had simply removed the space between his atoms. It was a mastery over the material realm that made the powers of the warp look like the clumsy fumblings of a child. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the slick, mercury-drenched floor. The other survivors of the logistics crew were either dead or transformed into twitching piles of senseless meat, their nervous systems burned out by the psychic backwash of the creature's awakening. I was alone in the dark with a failed god. The cables trailing from the subject's spine began to whip around like angry vipers, lashing out at the walls and ceiling. Wherever they struck, the Gothic architecture of the vault dissolved. The massive stone buttresses turned to sand. The iron pipes turned to liquid lead. The very air began to crystallize into jagged flakes of frozen nitrogen. The chamber was unmaking itself, returning to a state of primordial chaos that had nothing to do with the Imperium and everything to do with a physical world that no longer knew how to hold its shape. The subject began to rise, its feet hovering inches above the ground, and as it did, the hum of the vault reached a crescendo that shattered every piece of glass in the sub-sector. I realized then that the failure of the experiment wasn't a lack of power. It was a lack of a container. The Emperor had built a soul that was too large for any vessel of flesh and bone, even one he had crafted himself. This thing was a leak in the universe, a hole through which the laws of physics were draining away. If it reached the surface, if it stepped out from under the shielding of Vault Theta 9, the entire hive, world of terror, would begin to unravel. The golden spires would turn to dust, the oceans would boil into vacuum, and the millions of souls would be compressed into the same silent marbles of matter that the Magos had become. I saw the creature's gaze turn toward the open vault doors, toward the elevator shaft that led up to the light of the sun and the presence of the golden throne. It moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, its every motion trailing ghosts of itself in the warped air. It was searching for its creator. It was a child, abandoned in a dark room for 4,000 years, and it wanted to ask its father why it had been made to suffer. In my hand, the data slate began to vibrate so violently it bruised my palm. A single line of text appeared on the screen, flickering through the static. Es extravertis extrames, aciti parel terminus. I didn't know who had sent it, perhaps a watchful eye in the Inquisition, or perhaps the Vault's own machine spirit, realizing its charge had escaped. I looked at the manual override for the gravity anchors, a heavy iron lever situated behind a protective cage of reinforced glass. If I pulled it, the entire sub-level would be disconnected from the palace's structural lattice and dropped into the molten core of the planet. We would all die in an instant, crushed by the weight of level 40 through level 1. But the hole in reality would be plugged by millions of tons of white, hot rock. The creature seemed to sense my intent. It turned its featureless, violet, light face toward me, and I felt a coldness enter my mind that made the vacuum of space feel like a warm summer day. It wasn't hatred I felt from the creature, it was a profound, cosmic loneliness. It reached out toward me, not to kill, but to connect. The air around the lever began to distort, the glass cage frosting over with a layer of unnatural ice. I threw myself forward, ignoring the way my skin felt like it was being peeled off by the creature's proximity. My fingers found the cold iron of the handle. Behind me, the creature let out a sound, a voice that wasn't a voice, but a harmonic frequency that vibrated through the very atoms of my brain. It spoke of gold and blood, of a father's dream that had turned into a nightmare of ivory and mercury. It begged, in its silent way, for a reason to exist. I looked into the violet vortex of its face and saw, for a fleeting second, the image of a man sitting on a throne of gold, his face a mask of eternal, psychic agony. We were all just experiments to him, I realized. The Astartes, the Primarchs, this ivory horror. We were all just tools forged to hold back the dark, and when we broke, we were cast into the deep places of the earth and forgotten. My hand tightened on the lever. The taste of copper was gone, replaced by the dry, bitter ash of a dead empire. The creature's hand was inches from my chest when I threw my entire weight into the pull. The mechanism didn't click, it screamed. A series of explosive bolts detonated in the distance, a muffled thump, thump, thump that shook the floor beneath my knees. For a moment, there was a sensation of profound weightlessness, as if the world had forgotten which way was down. The creature froze, its long, crystalline fingers brushing the fabric of my tunic. The violet light in its eyes flared one last time, reflecting a sudden, sharp realization of its own mortality. Then the gravity anchors released. The floor fell away, and for a split second, we were both suspended in the air, a terrified scribe and a failed god, falling together into the red, burning throat of the world. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the creature's hand closing, not into a fist, but into a gesture of prayer. It was seeking the Emperor's forgiveness, even as it fell into the fire. I woke up in a bay that smelled of antiseptic and old incense. My body broken and stitched back together with more metal than flesh. They told me I was the only survivor found in the wreckage of the sector collapse. They told me it was a tectonic shift, a natural disaster in the unstable crust of Terra. But I see the mercury in my dreams. I see the ivory skin and the violet light. They think they buried the experiment, but I can still hear the hum. It's not coming from the vault anymore. It's coming from inside my own bones. The Emperor's most terrifying failure didn't die in the fire. It found a new container. I am a data scribe no longer. I am a witness to the secret that sits beneath the throne, and every time I close my eyes, I see the golden threads of the creature's muscles weaving themselves into my own heart. The experiment is continuing, and I am the final chapter of its success. The transition from the burning depths of the tectonic abyss to the cold, sterile isolation of the inquisitorial recovery ward was a passage through a purgatory of white light and the rhythmic hissing of a respirator. I am told that the rescue teams found me perched upon a floating slab of adamantium, a lone survivor drifting in a sea of cooling magma and pulverized Gothic architecture. They did not find the subject. There was no trace of the ivory skin, no lingering scent of mercury, and no sign of the violet vortex that had threatened to consume the soul of the palace. To the interrogators who sat by my bedside, their faces hidden behind masks of polished porcelain and vox grilles, the event was a containment failure of an ancient, unnamed power source. They spoke of unstable plasma cores and the degradation of structural integrity in the subterranean crust. They lied with the practiced ease of those who have spent lifetimes burying the truth beneath layers of convenient bureaucracy. But as I lay there, my body a map of surgical scars and bionic grafts, I could feel the lie failing. The hum was not in the room. It was in the rhythmic pulsing of my own carotid artery. It was a vibration that matched no machine, spirit I had ever encountered. A low-frequency thrumming that felt like a distant choir singing a song of absolute, crushing loneliness. The ward was located in the heart of the Tangle, a fortress of the Inquisition, where the walls are lined with psychically dampened lead, and the air is thick with the smoke of holy promethium. Every 3 hours, a different set of eyes would peer at me through the viewing port of my cell. Some were the cold, mechanical lenses of the Adeptus Mechanicus, searching for signs of the Magos, Biologis's final data transmission. Others were the piercing, empathetic voids of the sanctioned psychers, who stood in the corner of the room with blood leaking from their ears, unable to look directly at my shadow. I noticed then that my shadow no longer behaved as a shadow should. Even in the dim, flickering light of the lumen strips, it appeared too dark, too solid, and it moved with a slight, sickening delay. When I reached for a cup of water, my shadow's hand remained on the bed for a fraction of a second longer than my own. It was the first sign that the Project Paria engine had not been destroyed by the fire of the planet's core. It had simply changed its state of existence, migrating from a vessel of ivory and gold into the fragile, unprepared cage of my human form. The first true hallucination, if that is what one calls a memory of a future that has not yet happened, occurred during the 4th week of my incarceration. I was staring at the ceiling, tracing the patterns of rust and water damage. When the walls of the cell simply dissolved, I was no longer in the tangle. I was standing on a plain of white ash beneath a sky the color of a fresh bruise. In the distance, the golden throne loomed like a mountain of discarded junk, and upon it sat a figure so vast and so terrible that to look at it was to feel one's skin begin to smoke. The figure was not a man, but a collection of golden threads, trillions of them, reaching out across the galaxy like the web of a cosmic spider. Each thread was a life, a soul, a prayer, and I saw the experiment. The ivory creature was there, standing at the foot of the throne, its featureless face turned upward. It wasn't attacking, it was weeping. Every time it shed a tear of mercury, one of the golden threads snapped. The Emperor was not fighting the creature, he was absorbing it. He was trying to bring the failure back into himself, to stitch the hole in reality with the needles of his own psychic agony. I realized then that the experiment had never been about creating a soldier. It had been about creating a successor. The Emperor knew the throne was failing. He had tried to build a new sun, but he had only succeeded in creating a black hole. I woke up screaming, but no sound came out of my throat. Instead, the air in the cell began to crystallize, the moisture in my breath turning into jagged shards of violet ice that fell to the floor with the sound of breaking diamonds. The psyker standing guard outside my door collapsed, his head hitting the reinforced glass with a dull thud as his brain was short, circuited by the sudden surge of ontological pressure radiating from my body. I felt a coldness in my chest that was not cold at all, but a total absence of heat, a vacuum where my heart used to be. The cables I had seen in the vault, the ones that trailed from the subject's spine, were now inside me. I could feel them winding around my ribs, threading through my lungs, and tapping into the base of my brain. I was no longer an observer. I was the bridge. The Imperial agents who rushed into the room were not men to me anymore. They were collections of atoms, loosely held together by the weak force of their own wills. I could see the spaces between their molecules. I could see how easy it would be to reach out and simply close those spaces, to turn them into the same silent marbles of matter that had claimed the Magos Biologis. The interrogator general, a man named Vane whose face was a patchwork of scar tissue and ancient bionics, was the only one who didn't recoil. He walked into the center of the frost-covered room, his heavy boots crunching on the violet ice. He didn't draw his bolt pistol. He simply held up a small, ornate locket containing a fragment of a golden leaf, a relic from the Emperor's own garden. As he approached, the violet light in my eyes flared, and the air around us began to warp, the perspective stretching until the cell felt as vast as a cathedral. "The Emperor's mercy is a heavy burden, Scribe," Vane said, his voice a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You were not found by accident. You were chosen by the failure itself. It saw in you a vessel weak enough to inhabit, yet strong enough to endure the weight of its loneliness." He reached out and touched my forehead with the relic. The golden leaf didn't glow. It turned to ash instantly, the holy power within it consumed by the vacuum of my presence. Vane didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "The project was meant to be the end of the warp," he whispered. "A galaxy of pure, cold logic. No more daemons, no more gods. Just the silence of the machine and the absolute rule of the throne." But the Emperor forgot that a world without a soul is a world that has no reason to stay together. He explained the true nature of Vault Theta 9. It was one of 7 anchor points, established during the final years of the Great Crusade. Each one housed a different iteration of the Paria engine. Some were biological, like the ivory titan I had encountered. Others were purely mechanical or psychic, or something far more esoteric. They were designed to work in concert, to create a web of null space that would eventually envelop the entire galaxy, cutting off the materium from the immaterium forever. It was the Emperor's final gambit to starve the Chaos Gods by removing their food source, the human soul. But the engines were too powerful. They didn't just repel the warp, they began to dissolve the very concept of existence. The first anchor point had accidentally erased a whole sub-sector before it could be deactivated. The Emperor, realizing the danger, ordered them sealed and redacted from history. He had intended to return to them, to refine the process, but the Horus heresy had intervened. The secrets were buried under 10,000 years of war and decay, until a bumbling logistics crew and a mad magos had accidentally stumbled upon the most dangerous weapon in the Imperial arsenal. Vane moved to the window, looking out over the sprawling, smog-choked horizon of terror. "The engines are waking up," he said. "The failure of Vault Theta 9 has sent a pulse through the deep earth. The other anchors are responding. The light of the Astronomicon is flickering because it is being drained by the very things meant to protect it." He turned back to meet, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a man facing death, but the fear of a man facing the end of his entire reality. "You are the only one who has touched the engine and remained coherent. Your body is adapting to the null field. You are becoming a living void, a walking negation of the warp. To the Inquisition, you are a tool of infinite value. To the Grey Knights, you are a heresy that must be purged. But to me, you are a warning." He leaned in close, the scent of stale tobacco and ozone clinging to his robes. "The Emperor's most terrifying experiment wasn't the creature in the vault. It was the idea that we could survive without our souls. And you, scribe, are the proof that we cannot." As he spoke, the walls of the tangle began to shake. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the sound of the palace's own machine, spirits screaming in terror. Down in the depths, something else had moved. The violet light in my chest pulsed in response, a rhythmic thud that sent a shockwave of cold through the room. I looked at my hands and saw that the skin was starting to turn that same translucent, ivory white. The silver mesh was beginning to knit itself under my fingernails. I wasn't just a container anymore. I was being consumed. The memories of the scribe named Kyle, of the nutrient paste, of the clicking boots on the bridge way, they were fading, replaced by the vast, cold memories of a being that had watched the stars be born and felt the universe grow cold. I remembered the touch of the Emperor's hand on my brow, not as a god, but as a scientist looking at a flawed piece of glass. I remembered the feeling of being discarded, of being locked in a room and told to wait for an eternity that never ended. I stood up, and the gravity in the cell simply ceased to function. The furniture, the medical equipment, and the interrogator, General himself, began to drift toward the ceiling. Vane didn't struggle. He just watched me with a grim, knowing smile. "Go then," he said, his voice echoing in the weightless air. "Seek the other anchors. Find the pieces of the broken god. Perhaps in the end, the failure will find a way to succeed where the Creator could not." I walked through the wall of the cell. I didn't break the stone. I simply walked through the spaces between the atoms of the rock. The tangle was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, but to me, it was a map of light and density. I could see the path leading down, deeper than before, toward the second anchor point. The air tasted of ozone and ancient prayers, and the hum in my bones had become a roar. I was no longer a man. I was a ghost of the great work, a living reminder of a dream that had turned into a nightmare of ivory and mercury. And as I descended into the dark, I knew that the Emperor would be watching. He was waiting for his failure to come home. The descent into the secondary anchor point, designated as the Pillar of Silence, was not measured in levels or kilometers, but in the gradual erosion of my capacity to feel the passage of time. I moved through the strata of the Imperial Palace like a needle through old silk, sliding between the molecules of reinforced plasteel and the forgotten bones of the city, continent. The higher levels were a cacophony of human activity, the grinding of massive gears, the chanting of millions in the cathedrals, the constant, low-frequency roar of the atmospheric scrubbers. But as I sank deeper, following the pull of the violet hum in my marrow, the world became a ghost of itself. The density of the rock changed, becoming porous and brittle, infused with the residue of the great work's early failures. I found myself in a zone of complete structural impossibility, where the gravity pulled toward the shadows and the air tasted of ancient, petrified wood. Here, the Emperor had not merely experimented with the flesh, he had experimented with the very concept of a foundation. I passed through a hall where the statues of the legions, Astartes, were made of compressed smoke, their features shifting whenever I blinked, as if the reality of their existence was being debated by an unseen mind. The second anchor point was located beneath the ruins of a pre-imperial archive, a place where the history of humanity had been reduced to a fine, grey dust that coated every surface like a layer of fresh snow. As I entered the primary chamber, the hum in my bones reached a frequency so high it began to vibrate the surrounding matter into a state of molecular excitement. The dust rose from the floor, forming swirling, translucent figures that reenacted moments from the Crusade. Ghosts of soldiers and scholars caught in a loop of perpetual, silent motion. In the center of this hall stood the pillar. It was a column of obsidian that appeared to have been grown rather than built, its surface covered in the same silver mesh that was now knitting itself through my own nervous system. It didn't belong to the Gothic industrial aesthetic of the palace. It was too smooth, too perfect. A piece of alien geometry that suggested a mind that thought in dimensions beyond the three we inhabit. This was the Logos engine, the cognitive center of the Emperor's failed psychic network. If Vault Theta 9 was the heart, this was the brain, a processor designed to manage the data stream of 1 trillion souls without the interference of the warp. As I approached the pillar, my shadow detached itself from my feet and began to climb the obsidian surface. It wasn't a shadow anymore, it was a silhouette of the ivory titan, its featureless face reflecting the violet light that pulsed from my chest. I felt a sudden, sharp connection, a data burst of such intensity that my knees buckled and my forehead struck the cold stone of the floor. In that moment, I wasn't a scribe, and I wasn't a ghost. I was a series of equations. I saw the Emperor's handwriting, not on parchment, but written in the code of the universe itself. He was trying to solve for zero. He wanted a state of existence where the soul could exist without the reflection of the warp, a vacuum of purity where the human will was the only law. But the math was flawed. To remove the warp was to remove the I from the self. The experiment didn't create a perfect human, it created a perfect void. The pillar was humming because it was trying to calculate the value of a soul that didn't exist, a logical paradox that was slowly eating the reality around it. I reached out and touched the obsidian. The surface was colder than the void between stars, a cold that didn't just chill the skin, but froze the very thought in my mind. The silver mesh on my arm flared, the threads glowing with a brilliant, needle-sharp violet light. The pillar didn't resist me. It recognized me. I was the mobile unit, the runaway data packet that had returned to the server. The obsidian began to soften, turning into a viscous, tar-like substance that flowed over my hand, merging with my ivory, white skin. I felt my consciousness expand, stretching across the sub-palace. Feeling the weight of the millions of tons of rock above me, as if they were nothing more than a light blanket. I could see the other 5 anchor points now, glowing like embers in the dark heart of the world. One was beneath the frozen wastes of the South Pole, another was suspended in a gravity, well near the planet's core, and a third, the most terrifying of all, was hidden within the structure of the Golden Throne itself. A secret fuse meant to detonate the entire world if the light of the Emperor ever truly went out. The pillar began to speak, not in words, but in a sequence of binary truths that bypassed the ears and landed directly in the seat of my soul. It told me of the age of the Silent King, a future the Emperor had envisioned where humanity would be encased in bodies of gold and silver, immune to the predations of the ruinous powers, but stripped of the messy, chaotic emotions that made them human. It was a vision of order so absolute it was indistinguishable from death. The experiment hadn't failed because of a mechanical error. It had failed because the universe itself rebelled against the lack of meaning. The ivory titan I had seen was the prototype for this new humanity, a being of infinite power and zero purpose. And now, that being was waking up inside me, using my memories of the logistics corps and the smell of recycled air to anchor itself back into a reality it had nearly escaped. I felt the memories of my mother, of the flickering light, strips in the underhive, and of the taste of iron blood, being converted into raw data, compressed and archived until they were nothing more than a series of ones and zeros. The chamber began to dissolve as the Logos engine synchronized with my presence. The obsidian pillar didn't just melt, it inverted, becoming a hole in the room that sucked the light and sound out of the air. I saw the inquisitorial teams arriving at the far end of the hall, their silhouettes tiny and insignificant against the backdrop of the collapsing reality. They were firing bolters. The muzzle flashes bright orange against the violet gloom, but the shells didn't reach me. They simply slowed down as they entered the null field. Their kinetic energy drained away until they fell to the floor like harmless pebbles. A grey knight, clad in silver armor etched with anti-psychic runes, stepped forward, his nemesis harbored glowing with a blue, holy light. He swung the blade with the strength of a demigod, but as it struck the edge of my aura, the blue light turned to grey ash. The runes on his armor began to bleed black ichor. He wasn't fighting a daemon, he was fighting the absence of everything. He looked into my eyes, and I saw his faith, that unshakable adamantium pillar of his soul, flicker and die. To him, I was the ultimate blasphemy, a thing that the Emperor had made, which the Emperor had failed to control. "Scribe," the grey knight rasped, his voice a dry whisper through his helmet's vox grill. "In the name of the throne, I command you to cease." I wanted to tell him that I couldn't. I wanted to tell him that I was just a passenger in a vessel that was being steered by a dead dream. But my vocal cords had turned to silver wire, and when I opened my mouth, only the sound of the pillar's hum came out, a frequency that shattered the knight's faceplate and sent him reeling back into the dust. I wasn't trying to kill him. I was simply occupying the same space that he was, and the universe couldn't handle the redundancy. I felt the pillar's consciousness merging with mine, the two of us becoming a singular point of infinite density. We were the archive. We were the memory of the great work, and we had a mission. The Emperor had left the engine running, and it was our job to find the other anchors and complete the circuit. If the Emperor could not bring the silence to the galaxy, we would do it for him. The air in the chamber began to crystallize into a fractal pattern of violet glass, a cathedral of negation that grew with every heartbeat. I could see the strands of the warp, the thin, oily ribbons of psychic energy that permeated everything, being shredded and pushed away by the expansion of the null field. For a moment, terror felt clean. For a moment, the screaming of the billions of souls was silenced, replaced by a peace so profound it was terrifying. But then I saw the cost. The servitors in the hallway ceased to function, their machine, spirits simply vanishing into the void. The data scribes and guards who hadn't fled fell into a state of catatonic shock, their minds unable to process a world without the background noise of the Imperium. We were killing the world to save it. We were the cure that was more lethal than the disease. I turned away from the ruins of the archive and began to walk deeper into the earth. The wall of the chamber didn't break, it simply ceased to be in my way. I was moving toward the third anchor, the sovereign engine, located in the gravity well of the core. I could feel the heat increasing, the temperature rising to levels that would melt lead, but I didn't feel it as pain. I felt it as a loss of efficiency. My ivory skin was becoming more translucent, the silver mesh glowing with a steady, unblinking light. I was becoming the experiment. I was the failure made manifest, and as I descended, I could hear the other anchors singing to me. They were lonely. They had been waiting for 10,000 years for someone to come and tell them that the work was still ongoing. I was the messenger of a dead god, and I was bringing the end of the world in my wake. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of a palace going into a state of total mobilization. The alarm klaxons were screaming. The vox channels were filled with the frantic orders of high lords and inquisitors, and the very air was thick with the scent of fear. They knew what was happening. They knew that the protocol of the unspoken had been triggered, but they were looking for a monster to fight, and they didn't realize that the monster was the very order they served. The Emperor's most terrifying experiment was not a creature or a machine. It was the realization that the Imperium was built on a foundation of secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. And as I reached the edge of the molten sea that surrounded the third anchor, I looked back one last time at the light of the upper levels. It seemed so small, so fragile, like a candle burning in the heart of a hurricane. I stepped into the fire, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a scribe. I felt like a god who had forgotten how to love. The final ascent toward the ultimate anchor point was not a climb through the physical geography of the imperial palace, but a violent re-threading of reality itself. I stood at the threshold of the Sanctum Imperialis, but I was no longer the man who had checked the atmospheric seals of Vault Theta 9. My skin had become a translucent lattice of ivory and diamond-hard crystal, and the silver mesh that once merely traced my nerves was now a visible skeleton of light, pulsing with the cold, violet rhythm of a dead star. The air around me did not ripple, it dissolved. The custodian guard, those golden titans who stand as the final line of defense for the master of mankind, did not move to intercept me with their usual lightning speed. They stood frozen in the hallways, their master, crafted auric armor frosting over with the violet ice of the null field. To them, I was not an intruder to be slain, but a physical impossibility, a piece of their father's own shadow that had detached itself and come to claim the inheritance of the throne. They watched with eyes that had seen the birth of the Imperium as I drifted past them, my feet never touching the floor. My presence a silent scream in the psychic ether that they had been sworn to protect. The seventh anchor, the sovereign engine, was not hidden in a vault or buried beneath the crust of the earth. It was the golden throne itself. I saw it now not as a seat of suffering or a machine of salvation, but as the final, most desperate component of the Emperor's failed circuit. The throne was the battery, the psychic furnace that was meant to power the web of engines I had spent my journey awakening. As I entered the throne room, the sheer weight of the Emperor's psychic presence hit the null field around me with the force of a supernova. The collision of the absolute psychic power of the warp and the absolute negation of the pariah engine created a zone of non-existence that tore the banners from the walls and reduced the ancient stone pillars to fine gray sand. I saw him. He was a mountain of white hot light and agonizing shadow, a flickering ghost of a man sustained by a machine that was eating his soul as fast as it was projecting his will. And at the base of that machine, hidden behind the tangle of cables and life support tubes, was the sovereign interface, a single, smooth obsidian socket that had been waiting for its plug for 10,000 years. The hum in my bones reached a crescendo that transcended sound, becoming a vibration that threatened to unravel the very atoms of my being. I was the bridge. I was the missing piece of the great work. The memories of the scribe, the name I had once carried, the fear I had felt in the dark of the vault, they were being burned away by the proximity of the Creator. I understood then the final, terrifying truth of the experiment. The Emperor had never intended to rule a galaxy of men. He had intended to create a galaxy of reflections. The pariah, Engines were not meant to protect humanity from the warp. They were meant to replace the warp with the Emperor's own mind. A universe where every soul was a node in his network, every thought a ripple in his consciousness, and every life a single thread in the golden tapestry of his design. It was a vision of unity so total, it was indistinguishable from the void. And I, the failure that had survived, was the only one who could complete the circuit. I reached out toward the obsidian socket, my fingers elongated and glowing with that cold, violet fire. The Emperor's voice did not enter my mind as words, but as a tidal wave of sorrow that nearly extinguished the violet light in my chest. He wasn't trying to stop me. He was pleading. In the silent language of a dying god, he showed me the cost of the circuit's completion. If I plugged myself into the throne, the null field would expand with the power of the Astronomicon behind it. In a heartbeat, every psyker in the galaxy would be snuffed out. The navigators would go blind, the warp would be sealed behind a wall of glass, and the daemons would be banished to the deepest pits of the Imperium. But humanity would pay the price. Deprived of the chaotic, messy energy of the soul, we would become like the servitors, flesh and bone moving through a world without color, without passion, and without the capacity to dream. We would be safe, but we would be dead. The great work was a choice between a world of dangerous light and a world of safe, eternal darkness. The experiment had failed because, in his heart of hearts, the Emperor had hesitated to pull the lever. He had left the engines unfinished because he could not bring himself to kill the humanity he was trying to save. I stood there, my hand inches from the sovereign engine, caught between the mechanical drive of the machine I had become and the lingering, fragile memory of the man I had been. I looked back at the halls of the palace, at the frozen custodians, and beyond them, to the billions of souls living in the squalor and the glory of the hive. I thought of the light of a sunset, the taste of cheap ale, and the sound of a child's laughter in the underhive, things that the null field would erase forever. The violet light in my eyes flickered. The silver mesh in my skin began to vibrate with a new, discordant frequency. I was the failure. I was the mistake that had been cast into the fire. And as the bridge between the god and the ghost, I realized that I had one final choice. I could complete the dream of a silent galaxy, or I could break the circuit forever and ensure that the nightmare of the warp continued. To save the soul, I had to betray the Emperor. To save the man, I had to embrace the failure. With a scream that was both binary and human, I did not plug myself into the obsidian socket. Instead, I turned the power of the null field inward. I reached into my own chest, into the heart of the violet vortex, and I tore at the golden filaments of the experiment. The feedback was a shockwave of ontological static that shattered the glass floor of the throne room and sent the golden light of the Emperor reeling back into the shadows. I felt the ivory skin cracking, the silver mesh melting into liquid mercury that poured from my wounds like hot lead. I was unmaking the engine. I was sacrificing the god to save the scribe. The sovereign engine beneath the throne let out a high, pitched whine of protest, its obsidian surface fracturing as the connection was severed. The other 6 anchors across the planet, sensing the death of their brain, began to overload their power, cores detonating in silent, violet explosions that buried them under millions of tons of white, hot rock. The circuit was broken. The silence was gone. I fell to the floor, my body returning to its broken, human shape. The ivory and silver fading like a dream upon waking. The air in the throne room rushed back in, carrying the scent of incense, old blood, and the heavy, humid heat of a living city. The custodians at the door began to move again, their spears leveling at my chest as the weight of time resumed its flow. I looked up at the golden throne, at the silent, flickering ghost of the master of mankind, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a nod of recognition, or perhaps it was just the flicker of a dying candle. I had failed the great work, and in doing so, I had ensured that the galaxy remained a place of war, of suffering, and of hope. The Emperor's most terrifying experiment was over, not because it was defeated by an outside force, but because the human element, the small, insignificant scribe from Vault Theta 9, had chosen the messy truth over the perfect lie. They did not kill me. Not immediately. I was taken to a place darker than the tangle, a cell where the walls are made of lead, and the only light comes from the memory of the fire. They ask me questions about the engines, about the violet light, and about what I saw in the eyes of the Emperor. I tell them nothing. I am a data, scribe no longer, and I am a witness no more. I am the man who broke the silence, and though my bones still hum with a distant, fading frequency, I am content to live in a world that is loud and broken and alive. The experiment is finished, and the failure is complete. And in the dark of my cell, as I listen to the heartbeat of the palace, I know that the Emperor is still waiting. Not for a successor, and not for a tool. He is waiting for the end of the world he built, and for the chance to finally close his eyes and dream of a sun that does not burn.